As I mentioned at the beginning of Mass, we are delighted to have Cardinal Wuerl participate in our Year of Mercy series this evening. During this extraordinary Jubilee Year of Mercy, Pope Francis is challenging all believers to become a more effective sign of the Father's action in our lives. The Holy Father has expressed his desire that this year be a time when the witness of believers might grow stronger and more effective. The 2014 and 2015 Synods on the Family were a time whose ultimate goal was to strengthen the witness of believers throughout the world, as these synods examined the situation of families in today's world. The result of the synod process is the Apostolic Exhortation Amoris, Laetitia, the joy of love, which Pope Francis issued on March 19th of this year. Tonight, Cardinal Wuerl, who was appointed by Pope Francis as a member of both the 2014 and the 2015 Synod on the Family, will unfold Amoris Laetitia, which His Eminence has referred to as both a beautiful gift and an extraordinary challenge to the Church. Following tonight's presentation, Cardinal Wuerl, who is well known for his teaching ministry, is also the author of numerous articles and over 12 books, including best-selling catechisms. His Eminence will spend a few moments outside of the Crypt Church in the Hall of American Saints to hold a book signing. Please welcome His Eminence, Cardinal Donald Wuerl.
Before beginning these reflections, I want to thank Monsignor Walter Rossi, the rector of the Basilica here, the National Shrine of Our Lady, the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, first of all, for the thoughtful invitation to be here, and then for your very, very kind introduction. Thank you, Monsignor. And I'm grateful to have an opportunity to be a part of this program, this series of talks that is a part of this Jubilee year. I'm going to say a few words about the Synod, as Monsignor just mentioned, but we need to put it in context. It was just over 50 years ago that the Second Vatican Council was concluding its work, and Pope Paul VI thought, wouldn't it be good if there were some way to keep alive this spirit that grows out of having the bishops in council? Well, he couldn't very well invite all 2,500 back. So what he did was he established what we now are used to as the Synod of Bishops. What is it? Every 3 years or so, the Pope invites a number of bishops. Right now it's up to about 240. So they are reflective of, they're representative of, they represent in some way the Church around the world. And beginning with the Synod in 1974, the first one was in 1967. Then there was another one in 69 and another one in 71. But at the 74 Synod, Pope Paul said, after all the work that's gone on, after all the deliberations and all the conversation and all the reflection, shouldn't there be some sort of document, something, a teaching document at the end of it? And so the very first one of these documents came out of the 1974 Synod. This apostolic exhortation that we're going to talk about, the joy of love, is the most recent of 11 such post-synodal apostolic exhortations. Now, there's a handle, there's a name. But all it means is this is the Holy Father's exhortation to the Church that follows on the Synod that presented the material that he used to write this exhortation. The Synod's that are reflected now in Amoris Laetitia, in this wonderful post-synodal apostolic exhortation, were the two synods, because this was something also new. Instead of having one every 3 years, the Holy Father said, we're going to be talking about marriage, we're going to be talking about the family, and because marriage is under such stress today, and because it is so important, we're going to have two back-to-back synods. One in 2014 to talk about all the problems, all the challenges that synods are facing, that marriages are facing. And then we'll have another synod on the wonder, the beauty, the great gift that marriage is. And in the meantime, there was the World Meeting of Families here in our own country, in Philadelphia. And all of this was to call our attention to the importance of marriage, to the wonderful and beautiful gift it is, and to the challenge to marriage that our modern culture presents. And the Holy Father also chose in this process to do what the Second Vatican Council did, to lift up the role of bishops. The Holy Father said, as Paul VI said, the Pope is head of the College of Bishops, but he works with the bishops. And the bishops gather always with and under Peter. But it's a whole college, just as the apostles were the college of the apostles, the body of apostles. And so Pope Francis chose to highlight once again the role of bishops in collaboration with him. And that's why in this whole process, he kept asking the bishops, as they would come together in these synods, as he said, speak freely and openly, listen with humility, and let us all be open to the work, the movement, the action of the Holy Spirit. And that's what happened during that whole period. At the end of all the discussions, at the end of all the deliberations, the Holy Father said, what I would like to have happen now, so that I can produce an apostolic exhortation, I'd like to have a consensus document. I'd like all of you bishops here in the Synod to produce something that reflects a consensus you've all shared. And the Holy Father put together a team of 10 members of the Synod to write down what we heard during that entire time, boil it down so that it would be the main points that everybody agreed on. That's why when it was all done, the last 2 days of the Synod, all the bishops present get the text, get this copy. It's some 60 paragraphs, because even though it was only 2 months, there's a lot to say about marriage. There's a lot to say about family. And there's a lot to say about how important it is that we live our faith and live our commitment and bear witness to the wonder of marriage. And then the Pope asked all of the bishops, paragraph by paragraph, to vote, to show whether this did represent what they had talked about, what we had talked about during that time. And the result was that every one of those paragraphs received 2/3 or more votes. In fact, almost all of them received 95% approval. I'm not sure why some of them got 1 or 2 negative votes. I think the bishop must have pushed the wrong button. We vote electronically, But it was clear this was overwhelmingly the consensus of the bishops. That's why I refer to this exhortation as a consensus document. It simply says, this is what the bishops said. And when you read it, we gave all this material to the Holy Father, and he began then to put it together into what would be his statement of it. But when you read it, you'll find all those paragraphs that we had voted on. That's what he used, and he footnotes them all, as if to say, this really is your work. But he didn't just use what we said. The Holy Father went back and he cited the teaching of all of his recent predecessors in the office. He begins and relies so much on Paul VI, and then John Paul II, and Benedict. But he goes even further back than that in listening to all the voices of the papal magisterium since the council and formulating the teaching. He also went back to that great body of faith that we find in Thomas Aquinas, that we find in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that we find in the great teaching tradition of the Fathers. When you read Amoris, Laetitia, just look at the footnotes. Don't do it before you begin to read. You might get frightened. There's so many of them. You might get discouraged, but those footnotes reflect the whole history of our church teaching. And that's why I like to think of this post-synodal apostolic exhortation as not just a consensus document, but it really is a continuity document. It simply says, folks, this is what we believe. This is what we have always believed. But now, how do we live that today? And this is the challenging part. There's a sense in which, standing on the foundation of all that went before him, our Holy Father is saying, we need to be absolutely comfortable with who we are, our Catholic identity, our Catholic teaching. But now we have to go out, and we have to begin to encounter people who should be with us at Mass, people whose marriages are broken, people who are living in very difficult situations, and people who need to hear that whatever their condition is, they're still part of the family. They're still part of the family. And I think that's one of the most beautiful parts that Pope Francis highlights. The joy of love experienced by families is also the joy of the church. That's how he begins the document. The joy of love experienced by families is also the joy of the church. And as Monsignor pointed out, he signed the document on the solemnity of St. Joseph, patron of our spiritual family, the church. And in the opening chapters of this beautiful document, Pope Francis discusses God's creation and God's plan for marriage and family, and how this is all revealed in Scripture. In Genesis, in the beginning, he created the male and female and brought them together and said, increase and multiply and fill the earth. And Jesus says to us, that's the way it was in the beginning, that's the way it's supposed to be today. And then this beautiful scriptural image is contrasted with what we experience in family life today. Torn families, and all of the problems that they face. Particularly challenging, the Pope tells us, is the individualism of today, which seems to rely so heavily on emphasis on ourselves that it's very, very difficult for people sometimes to break out of that long enough to say, we, to move from the me of self into a marriage that says, we do this, and we have to make our way. All the more reason, the Pope says, because of this individualism and because of the throwaway culture we live in. And the more I hear that term that he uses, the more I think we can all recognize that's so true of the culture that we live in. The throwaway culture, that not just material things that we get tired of, we throw away, but we don't think of relationships, friendships, a marriage as something that is intended to endure forever. And that's part of the challenge of this culture, that commitment, the Holy Father tells us, and we spoke of that in those synods. Commitment is not something that is so evident in our culture, in our world today. And because of that, there's a greater need in the church to help couples and families respond to the grace of God, the grace that God offers us. The one thing we know is that God's grace is always there. We have to avail ourselves of it. Just like the Holy Father said about God's mercy. It's always there. God never tires of forgiving. We sometimes get tired of asking. And I think that's true. It's true of all of the elements that the Synod talked about. That God's grace is there, but the struggle, the challenge to be open to that grace is what we need to be helping one another with. The Holy Father reminds us the vocation to family life family life itself reveals the love of God. God so loved us, he created us. He so loved us that he sent Jesus to redeem us. And he so loved us that he shares his love in the form of human love. We just had here in this basilica, a Sunday ago, we had the wonderful celebration of marriage anniversaries, going all the way from 25 to 74 years. 800 couples celebrating collectively 36,000 years of married life. I said to the young people in church, look around. This is proof it works. This is proof it can be done. But it takes work. And as soon as I said that, about 800 couples shook their head. Yes, it takes work. That's what the Holy Father is saying. He's saying to us, it takes a lot of work. But in the world in which we live, where there are so many challenges, and where there are so many broken families, and so many marriages that have come apart, he says to us, this authentic love still faces barriers. And we need to be loving brothers and sisters to all the members of our family. Everyone has to feel, even in their brokenness, they're a part of the family. And the Holy Father is saying to us in this beautiful apostolic exhortation, the goal, the ideal, and that ideal is lived by many, many people. We just had a basilica filled with them. But in those instances where the ideal, we fall short of that beautiful, beautiful reality, we need to be there. We need to be inviting. We need to simply say, We recognize that. But don't stop being with us. You might, all of us, have a long way to go, but don't stop journeying together with us. And without claiming to present an entire pastoral plan, our Holy Father calls for family apostolates throughout the church. He says we need to offer better catechesis. Now, this is something I think we can all agree to. We need to offer our young people a better understanding of what it is the church offers them, what it is Jesus is offering them, what it is marriage is all about. They're not going to get it from the movies. They're not going to get it from the music they listen to. They're not going to get it from listening to all of the people who form public opinion in our nation. They're not going to get a view that a man and a woman come together and they commit themselves to each other and they're prepared to live that commitment for the rest of their lives. And the Holy Father is saying, we have to find ways, catechetically, formationally, to help the next generation understand that. One of the things that I very much appreciate when I come here to the shrine, and one of the things that I find very, very nurturing, is when the university is in session, there are usually many young people here. Young people who come to the shrine, come to pray, come to Mass, and we have to continually keep encouraging them. They're hearing the church's catechesis. They're being formed on this campus in the teaching of the church. But we know there are so many that just aren't hearing that because of so many circumstances in their lives. Our task is to try to be there every opportunity we get with those who are trying to hear, and with those who have heard and are still suffering. In Amoris Laetitia, the priority of charity and mercy in Catholic moral theology are put into the active service of the Church's pastoral mission. Here we are celebrating the Jubilee of Mercy, the Holy Door of Mercy, and our Holy Father is saying, mercy is a manifestation of God's love. In the Synod, one very, very senior priest gave a talk, and the line I remember most from it was, he was 80 years old. He had been invited by the Pope to speak because he had been in a parish, he had served in a parish as a pastor in a small hill-town parish for 50 years. But he said, when the love of God that created all things encounters the human condition that we've created, the love of God becomes God's mercy. And that's reflected in this beautiful apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia. Charity and mercy are the beautiful gifts of God to us. In many respects, the Holy Father's response to the Second Vatican Council's priority on a moral theology that is focused on charity, on love, is at the heart of this second part of the apostolic exhortation. Pope Francis approaches his teaching ministry first and foremost as a pastor of souls. Indeed, in many places in the document, one hears the voice of a pastor speaking directly to his flock, to members of his flock, sharing his own experience and wisdom formed over many years of priestly service. But this pastoral effort is summarized in 4 principal activities, and I would like to touch briefly on them this afternoon, this evening. Our Holy Father, from his vision, says that the pastoral mission of the Church focused on the living experience of mercy and love, and recognizing the human condition all around us, is expressed in 4 principal activities: listening, accompanying, discerning, and evangelizing. The listening. Our Holy Father demonstrated that during the Synod. He came to all of those sessions and listened and listened and listened, as bishop after bishop after bishop got up and spoke of his experience in his diocese, of his experience with his priests and pastors caring for the faithful, and particularly the challenges that we face in dealing with marriages, in dealing with young people and convincing them they want to enter a marriage, and then working with those whose marriages have suffered. The process, listening to the faithful. That's what this whole idea of synodality is all about. The Pope is saying we have to be working together, we have to be listening together, and we have to be praying together and ministering together. But the second activity, which the document stresses, is pastoral accompaniment. The accompaniment of families by the community of the church. No one makes their way through life all by themselves. And so in the ecclesial community, in the church community, when a couple are joined in marriage, when they receive that beautiful sacrament, the rest of the church has to be there with them. It's not something that we simply leave to each of us alone to make our way. The church is supposed to be supportive of its members. It's supposed to be encouraging of its members, and it's supposed to be there for one another. Pope Francis asked pastors to do more than just teach the church's document, although clearly we have to do that. Pastors, he says, must take on the smell of the sheep. We all hear that so often. They must take on the smell of the sheep whom they serve, so that the sheep are willing to hear their voices. Pope Paul, years and years and years ago, when he was writing that first post-synodal apostolic exhortation, said, people today will listen to witnesses before they will listen to teachers. And if they listen to teachers, it's because the teacher's a witness. We're supposed to be able to demonstrate in the love we bring as a faith community, as a church, to witness the compassion, the care, the mercy of Jesus. That's why the Holy Father keeps speaking about the 2 elements, mercy and love. They both are expressions of the same reality of God's presence. The church's pastoral ministry to families is aimed at helping them to grow in the practice and art of discernment. And that's the third of the elements: listening, accompanying, discerning. The Holy Father insists that the church's pastors must make room for the consciences of the faithful, who very often respond as best they can to the gospel amid their limitations, and are capable of carrying out their own discernment even in complex, very complex situations. He says, we've been called to form consciences, not to replace them. Part of the task of priests today, of catechists today, part of the tasks of parents today is to pass on the beauty of our faith, to pass on the wonder of our faith, but at the same time, walk with and help those who are struggling to see what you and I accept as so beautiful. Help them see the beauty and the wonder of our faith. Those in irregular situations, such as the divorced and civilly remarried, should be invited to a deeper inclusion into the life of the church. But the Holy Father is very clear. We're not changing any teaching, we're not changing any doctrine, but we're saying to people who are struggling, walk with us, continue to be with us. You're still part of the family. Admittedly, this individual process of discernment may not be easy. A person may know full well the Church's teaching, and Pope Francis notes that, yet they may have great difficulty in either understanding its inherent positive value or being able fully to embrace it right away because of their circumstances. And he says, continue to walk with them, continue to welcome them, because in that way, both of you might get a little closer to the Lord. The exhortation, I think, reminds us of something very, very beautiful. Each one of us falls short of what God asks us to be. But the way we are going to get to be what God asks us to be is as members of his family, living in the sacraments, alive in the grace of God. And that, I think, is a takeaway from this apostolic exhortation. We know what the faith teaches. We know the obligations and the challenges. We try to live them. And for those that are struggling and fall short of the fullness of that, which is everybody here, then we need to be together in the journey that leads us closer and closer to the Lord. And finally, if we do all of this, if we're listening and we're accompanying and we're discerning, we're also evangelizing. We're also inviting people back. I think this is one of the gifts of Pope Francis, his ability to exude an invitation to come back, to try all over again, to be as close to Christ as we can. I was standing at the carousel, the luggage carousel at the airport, and as I was waiting for my bag, a lady came up and she said, we were on that flight together. And she said, you know, I think, Cardinal, I should be honest and tell you I'm a lapsed Catholic. But then she said, but when I listen to this Pope, I begin to hear an invitation to try all over again. And she said, and so I've started going back to church because the welcome is so real in Pope Francis. And then her bag came up and she said, well, I got to go. And I said, how about the next time that you introduce yourself to someone, why don't you say, I'm a former lapsed Catholic? That's what this is all about, isn't it? That's what the Synod and that's what the Apostolic Exhortation is all about. We know the teaching. Many of them don't. Many young people don't. We know how we're supposed to be making our way, and we know we don't always get it right. But we know we're supposed to be making our way in the grace of God, in the mercy of Christ, in the forgiveness of his church, and invite those who should be with us to make that journey with us. Our goal is to be perfect as is our Heavenly Father, but we all still have a long way to go. But we can draw closer to the Lord, who, by his grace, heals us and all those who we invite, who we go out, encounter, accompany, and bring back to the Lord. That's what this is all about. It's a beautiful vision. It's a wonderful image. We just have to realize it ourselves, in our lives, in our families, and particularly with the generation coming along. but it's worth it, isn't it? It's worth doing it. It's worth recognizing we can be instruments every bit of God's mercy and God's love, and at the same time be instruments of the beautiful revelation that is family, marriage, church, and the beautiful, beautiful gift of God's grace. Thank you.